Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor for me to be with you today. History gives us some extremely singular paradoxes. The Battle of Verdun is a shining example. From this conflict between brothers, which was one of the most terrible in our recent past, arose a symbol which stands in stark contrast with the political ambitions of the leaders who caused it to happen. The name of Verdun was already associated with a key episode in Europe's history because of the Treaty of 843, which shared out Charlemagne's empire between his three grandchildren. Today, it is associated with a much more peaceful image of reconciliation between peoples. I will avoid going back over the origins of the First World War, a topic which many works have dealt with, so that I can focus on the single episode of Verdun, 1916. It was a terrible battle. The front spanned both banks of the Meuse, and the strongly positioned German troops were determined to bleed the French army dry. The policy of the French, meanwhile, was based on a military strategy of "they shall not pass." Verdun became a symbol of national unity for the French, who did everything they could to resist the German enemy and halt its advance. Although Verdun's position was not of strategic military importance, the government felt that public opinion needed to be rallied around a focal point and make the defense of Verdun a national objective. The military staff implemented a turnover system whereby all fighting units were called to serve in Verdun. In rotation, each lasting 10 or 15 days, within less than 10 months, 3/4 of fighting troops passed through Verdun. The Battle of Verdun became a national issue for all French families. At the time, French servicemen used to say that if you haven't been to Verdun, you haven't fought in the war. Under this system, practically every family gave France a son, a brother or a son, and every family was able to pass on the memory of the atrocities in the fighting. Verdun was the most terrifying combat experience in the First World War, with a total of 700,000 men from both sides being killed or injured, 163,000 French fatalities, and 143,000 German fatalities. 1.2 million Germans fought there, 1.1 million Frenchmen fought there. 300,000 men died in the space of 300 days between the 21st of February and the 19th of December, making an average of 1,000 deaths per day. 60 million shells were fired across an area of 12 square kilometers, and 9 villages were completely destroyed. Verdun was not the deadliest battle of the First World War. On the Western Front, the Battle of the Somme killed many more men, over 400,000 in the same year. But it showed the strength of the artillery deployed by each of the protagonists. It was a battle in which areas of territory were taken and taken back many times. The village of Fleury was recaptured on 17 occasions. The forts of Douaumont and Vaux were sieged at the beginning of the battle and taken back in the autumn. The most fortunate of the soldiers lived in trenches, while others were held up in shell holes where they suffer from thirst, hunger, cold, or heat. The ground was bombarded so heavily that it lost its structure and consistency. Everything was pulverized and turned into powder, into which men sank with the rain. This was the famous mud of Verdun. However, on the 20th December 1916, the date that is regarded as marking the end of the Battle of Verdun, the positions that were held were virtually identical to what they had been when the fighting began the 21st February during the Corps Wood offensive. The myth of the battle came into being even before the battle ended. "They shall not pass" symbolized the heroic resistance of the town, which was hailed with several decorations. Verdun is France's most decorated town and was awarded the Légion d'honneur at the instigation of Tsar Nicholas II. The name and the battle became forever rooted in French collective memory. The same is true for Germany. However, the Second World War overshadowed this First World War. Verdun sums up the Great World War all by itself. It is said to be better known abroad than any other district of France apart from Paris. At the end of the war, the bruised soil of the Verdun battlefield was given protected status across an area of 12 square kilometers. 9 villages had disappeared, leaving behind a scene of moon-like desolation, which was devoid of vegetation and contained the body of hundreds of thousands of servicemen, together with a huge amount of shrapnel. This was why the French state decided to preserve in creating a sanctuary by planting trees from the beginning of the 1920s onwards and banning all reconstruction. From the beginning of the 1920s onwards, the Bishop of Verdun, Bishop Ginesti, raised funds to build Douaumont ossuary to house the bones of the servicemen whose bodies regularly emerged from the ground and give them a burial place that would be worthy of the soldier from both sides. The remains of 150,000 French and German men are kept there, closely intermingled in its crypt. It is estimated that over 80,000 other bodies still lie buried on the battlefield. The paradox that I talked about at the beginning of my speech is that over time, this place of first conflict between the nations of France and Germany became a place of reconciliation and then friendship between the two countries. This turnaround came about on several stages. It began with the wishes of the veterans. Even before the war was ended, they came together in memory of their brothers in arms. The veteran movement came into being within a few years. Many veterans joined the National Verdun Remembrance Committee. But it was only thanks to the forcefulness of their leaders, Maurice Genevoix, the permanent secretary of the Académie Française, that they introduced subscriptions and raised funds to build a memorial to the veterans of Verdun at the place where the fighting occurred. The first stone was laid in 1963. It was inaugurated in September 1967, more than 50 years after the battle. The veterans were already elderly. Time is probably the most critical factor in the creation of memory and the process of reconciliation. Already, in this memorial, which was created with donation from the veterans' family, the presence of both sides was apparent. The fact that Germany visited it was also significant. At the same time, the work of General de Gaulle and Chancellor Konrad Adenauer bore fruit. They were the first Franco-German pair. They first talks took place at La Boisserie in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises. They later met in Reims in 1967. A speech was given by de Gaulle during the ceremonies marking the 50th anniversary in 1966. Successive events strengthened the reconciliation between the two nations. the statue of Notre-Dame de l'Europe was added in 1979, the year of the first European elections, to the facade of the chapel of Fleury-de-Vendôme, one of the destroyed villages on the battlefield. On the 22nd September 1984, Kohl and Mitterrand stood hand in hand in front of Douaumont Ossuary, and very recently, the ceremonies marking the centenary of the Battle of Verdun were attended by Hollande and Merkel on the 29th May 2016. All remembrance activities in Verdun are now planned from Franco-German perspective. French, German, and European flags fly over Douaumont Fort. The aim of Maurice Genevoix, who oversaw the construction of the Verdun Memorial, was to build an edifice to commemorate the veterans at the scene of the fighting. I will quote Maurice Genevoix's word. This memorial was erected by the survivors of Verdun in memory of their comrades who fell during the battle, so that those who will come to reflect and contemplate at the place of their sacrifice can understand the ideal and the faith that inspired and sustained them. The veterans eventually chose the site of Fleury-de-Vendôme at the location of the former railway station when the fighting between the French and the Germans was at its fiercest and most violent. The memorial was inaugurated in 1967 by Minister Duvillard with a speech by Maurice Genevoix, which became extremely famous and was given before than more 3,000 people, 2,000 poilus, and 200 standard bearers. Little by little, the museum, which essentially contained photographs, plans, and maps giving a clear explanation of how the Battle of Verdun was waged, expanded as various collections were added to it. In the 1970s, an education department was created with history and geography teachers, seconded by the Ministry of National Education, with the aim of passing on the memory to the younger generation. 40 years after the memorial was opened to the public, building was showing signs of dilapidation and non-compliance with regulation, which became increasingly demanding for the public. There was an urgent need to carry out modernizing works. In addition, the collections that were on display, most of which had been donated by veterans' families over the year, no longer conveyed a clear message. It had become necessary to rethink the exhibition design. At the same time, the Meuse department was thinking about building an interpretation center dedicated to the battlefield, to the Battle of Verdun, as part of the efforts to commemorate the centenary of the Great War. At the end, the two projects were merged into a single project to ensure that the memorial could address a new area with the same emotional intensity and teach the young generation about this chapter in our history. The renovated memorial has retained its original spirit. In line with the veterans' wishes, the men who fought in Verdun, whatever their nationality, still constitute the essence of the place. The scientific advisory board of the memorial, which is made up of historians of various nationalities, French, German, British, American, oversaw the process. The building's identity was preserved in the process of expanding it. The very contemporary exhibition design speaks to young people with its language without distorting the history and spirit of the place. Our task is to bring to life and pass on the veterans' message from its definitively Franco-German perspective. There was no difference between the suffering of the fighters on both sides. When it was reopened to the public in February 2016, the French state wanted the memorial to be run, managed, and developed on a different legal context in order to guarantee its influence and continued existence. It was thus transformed into a public institution for cultural cooperation in order to implement a very cultural project across the entire battlefield in conjunction with the other remembrance sites, Douaumont-Euchery, Douaumont-Fort, Vaux-Fort, so that this battlefield could become a beacon of remembrance of the Great War with Europe-wide influence. The main goals of the institution are to stage ambitious cultural events of all kinds, both within it and outside it, for instance, temporary exhibitions, music, theater, conferences, film discussions, and so on, and run an educational program aimed to the widest possible audience in order to reach out to the young generation in particular. The education department had therefore designed online course. In France, we call it massive open online courses, with assistance from the University of Lorraine, the Ministry of Education, and the Scientific Advisory Board. These courses are free and can be accessed on the internet. In November, we will put the third round of these courses online. We have also developed a digital application which can be downloaded from the Apple Store to enable our younger visitors from classes in the second cycle of school education, 10, 11 years old, to have a more fun experience when they visit the museum. We must also now start thinking about what will happen after the centenary and look beyond the stage of the commemoration in order to plan historical tourism. Today's visitors do not behave the same way as the pilgrims who came here 50 years ago. If Verdun wants to go on generating as much interest, it needs to think about not only modernizing its remembrance sites by using modern technologies, but probably also diversifying what is offered to tourists, for example, by staging events with a broader popular appeal. This year, therefore, we have just held a gathering of historical reenactors of the army of 18 nations which fought in the First World War. Although the Battle of Verdun was fought solely between France and Germany, it embodies the Great War all by itself. It is also the symbol of reconciliation and hosts the World Center for Peace and Human Rights. As such, it is perfectly suited for this kind of events. We have also forged international links with other museums who have just tagged an exhibition with assistance from the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City. Together with the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, Switzerland, we are preparing for an exhibition about prisoners of war to be held in 2019. We have a plan to work together with a small town in Belarus, from which a delegation recently came to visit us. The partner agreements will be signed in October. We are planning to create an international network of the main museums dedicated to the Great War, and its first meeting could take place in October 2019 in Kansas City. Our approach is attracting interest from other countries which are thinking about the issue of reconciliation. We have been approached by Indian associations which want to build a memorial devoted to the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. They are curious about our experience. How were we able to progress from the terrible battle to reconciliation in a space of 100 years? It's really an issue for which Verdun could be regarded as a kind of testing ground. Although every situation is unique, it nonetheless seems to me that time plays a dominant role. Since the Battle of Verdun in 1960, we have moved from memory to remembrance, and then from remembrance to history. The passing of time allows us to do things which I think were unthinkable when there were still enough survivors of this conflict. So that's how I would sum up this first topic. It is at the cost of all these changes that Verdun will continue to exist after the commemorative ceremonies, and that Verdun will retain its power to attract a public which is curious to experience on a single site a cultural offering which will immerse it with emotion in an essential chapter of its history. Thank you for listening.